All right, welcome back. We are COMP301 in the summer 2020 semester, and it's week 2, part 1 of our broadcast. And we're going to be talking about Linux OS continued a little bit, and I'm also going to be talking about what we did last time, a little bit looking at the VM, talking about any issues you guys might be having and that kind of thing, because, people are having issues, and that's normal. People have issues with their VM. We'll talk about some alternatives, things that you can do differently, and system requirements that I recommend, like we talked about last week. So without further ado, are there any questions from last week that you want me to handle first? I think that's the first thing I'd like to kind of go over. Other than, unknown installation problems. I don't know why, but I can't install my VM. That kind of thing. Hopefully no one has any issues. Okay, so let's continue. So again, we're talking about Linux operating systems here in this course, and we're at week 2. So we're going to be using the GNOME desktop and the shell environment, and we're also going to be talking about Linux utilities. We're also going to get into a little bit of week 3 stuff. It looks like the coordinators have really done a fine job into compressing some of the content. So you're going to get a little bit of Linux file system starting off on Thursday. That's when we're going to start talking about that. But we're going to hit the file system today pretty much right away. And I will talk about how you can be more successful with your quiz. So the quiz is live. It's available now for you. And remember, there's going to be quizzes every week. They're worth 3% of your final grade, so please take them seriously. It's something that you're going to be having to work with over the the semester. So one thing to note when you do your quiz, it has 8 questions this time around. They're randomized, should be randomized, and you'll take 8 questions out of 16 that you have to answer. There's 16 possible questions, and you're going to answer randomly 8 of them. When you, for you to get the best result from your quiz, and I got to talk about this as well, I highly recommend you read the material. So you can look at PowerPoints from last week as well as this week, because this quiz, as I've noticed, again, it wasn't put together by me. But this quiz is something that is going to be used both this week and the content from this week as well as the content from last week in terms of the stuff from the book. All right, so it won't be including any of the installation pieces that we've talked about, which is good because some people are having issues. So I think that's one of the things that you want to look at. Please take a look at the PowerPoints that I've shared with you on eCentennial. So that's both from last week and this week. Okay, so one strategy might be wait until at least after today's session, and it should cover most of the things that you need to answer the quiz after today. All right, so there's some other material that I wanted to make sure that you have, that the other sections have, and so I've kind of put that into a lesson week, like lesson 2A. And then lesson 2B is going to be all the Linux file system stuff that we're going to start handling on Thursday. Okay, so that's what's happening there. And again, just as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be presenting assignment 1 to you on Thursday. If I can make it available earlier, I will. And this way you'll have until next week. I'll probably make it due by the end of the week next week to get it done. It will require a video or a report. I'm going to talk about the 2 things on Thursday and talk about what's the advantage and disadvantage of doing these things. The report will be more in depth. It'll ask you a lot more questions, and you'll have to do some examples and screenshots and that kind of thing. The video, I think, is much more straightforward. Most people should angle towards the video. I think it'll be easier for everybody. However, everyone has a different situation, and that's why I'm making the option either a report or a video. But however, I'd recommend a video. Also, just follow up from last day. Remember that last day It's going to go to last days now. Last day we talked about the history of Unix and Linux a little bit. We're going to be just revisiting that a little bit today. And I asked you guys, if you're interested, you can make a personal demo video to kind of talk about who you are, what you're interested in, you know, what do you think about the future, why you're in the program, that kind of stuff. And that's due tomorrow, if I'm not wrong. So I think you have, you know, a couple things that are happening this semester for you. Remember that this personal demo video is worth 5% bonus. So I highly recommend you get it done. I think it's a great opportunity for you to discuss who you are, what your plans are, all that kind of stuff. And it'll give me a chance to get to know you, as well as you can practice how to make a video, because you're going to be making videos for all of your assignments going forward. So I think that's kind of a good practice for you guys to get it done. I know some people have language issues. They haven't had a chance to present before, or there's been limited opportunities. But here's the reality, everyone. We're living in a connected world where we're broadcasting ourselves live across the internet. Here's an example of that today. And it's a great skill to kind of put together. And why? Because interviews, chances are, might happen remotely. You might do a video interview. Going forward, you might be asked to put together a demo for an application or product you're creating. So this is all great training for you guys, I think. And also, you know, an opportunity for you to express yourself, put some stuff down that maybe interests you. And every time you do a video, you get better and better at it. Okay, so I know that's how it was for me when I first started doing this kind of stuff. Here's a couple of notes before I move on from this part. How long does it have to be? It can be short, but if you noticed last week, I talked about the requirements of the video. As long as you hit the requirements of the video, and that means that, you know, like there's 4, I believe, slides that I've asked you to put together for the video, then you're good to go. However, what I'd like you to try and do is pace yourself. So don't rush through the stuff, the explanations. It shouldn't be more than 5 to 7 minutes. That's what I've kind of I've put in place. So try and aim for around 5 minutes, I think, is a good length. And this way you have a chance to talk about some of the things you're interested in. You may want to practice running through the PowerPoint before you record. You also can record multiple times and submit the one that works best for you. I remember that all you need is a link to YouTube or another service provider. It could be Vimeo, it could be you know, Twitch, it could be something else. As long as I get a link and there's nothing for me to download, it's good for me. I'm okay. You know, if I can go there and I don't have to log in anything, it's just click a link and it works. That's what I'm looking for. Please don't give me a link to your Google Drive, all right, or something like that. I will not accept that kind of thing. You will not get your bonus 5%. But if it's something else, if I'm just clicking a link and I can just see the video, that would suffice. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for. Okay. Yeah, so link, no download. That's the way I like it. And also it's good for you, right? Because you can give that link to another professor and say, here, professor, you know, there might be someone else down the line this semester or even next semester that might ask you, hey, who are you? Can you make a demo video? And if you have me, you know, I may ask you to do that again, right? So in another class. I may ask every class to do that for me. Why? If I don't know who you are, I may ask to see who you are and that kind of thing. One part of this is a bit of security too. It's like, hey, this is me. I'm doing this thing. And when you demo your assignments, a lot of times you're going to be demoing your assignments. You're going to go into your VM. You're going to show me your Python code later in the second half of the semester. And so it's going to, I think, train you on how to really talk about your stuff a little better. And I think it's a good exercise. Okay, so that's all I really want to talk about from a personal demo video. Again, it's a bonus. Try and get it done. Don't try and shy away from it. And I think it's a great start, you know, to get going in this semester. Okay, any questions around the demo video before I move on? Because that's something that we talked about last week. Okay, if there's no questions, then I'm going to move on to the next part. So today, what are we doing? I'm going to go into a little bit more about operating systems. Let's talk about your PC, kind of a PC versus server. kind of stuff we're going to be talking about a little bit. I'm going to review some of the stuff that we hit from a Linux OS perspective. I'm going to gloss over some of the things we've already talked about before, so literally just pass through the slide. The reason why I put them here is two things. One, I want us to conform to the other classes, make sure that we have all the same information from as the other sections do. I think that's good. A. B, I also want to make sure that you can hit all the keywords that you need. So when you're kind of doing your test, you have a chance to get maximum marks. And as for the tests, I'm just going to share your content for a second. So what you should do is, if you look at the content, I'm just going to bring that up here for a second. Under week 2, so here's week 2, right? You can see that there is quiz number 1, which is now available, all right? And it ends June 5th, that's Friday, at midnight. So that means anytime between now and midnight on Friday, you have a chance to do your quiz, okay? You can do it anytime. It's 10 minutes. Right? And that means you only have 10 minutes to do 8 questions. So there's a couple strategies around this. One is kind of read through your material, which will help you kind of, go to the questions. Chances are you may get a different kind of quiz the second time around. And usually the first time you do your quiz, you get the best result, typically. Okay? But it doesn't mean that it's always true. Sometimes second attempt is better. Again, this quiz is worth 3% of your final grade, the first one, so please take it seriously. I think it's something that it just goes over the material that we're going to be talking about today and as well as last week. So I think this is important to kind of do. Both lessons are here on your PDF, Lesson 2A and Lesson 2B. So those 2 lessons here, as well as the first link, which I'm doing right now, to the video. If you wanted to watch this live, it's right here. And we're going to be doing that every single week. You can always go back to the lessons and watch the videos if you need to help you with your assignments and your quizzes. Okay. So that is quiz in a nutshell. That's when it's going to be due this week. Any questions around your quiz? There are some from last week's material and some from today. All right, that's how they're formed, and that's why I wanted to make sure that I had all the stuff there for you guys to use, so that way you can always look at today's PowerPoints. Again, I wouldn't recommend starting the quiz. You get 2 attempts, absolutely. And the reason why you get 2 attempts is a couple reasons. One, I want to make sure that everyone has a good chance to do well, because I think it's important. I want everyone to do well in this course. One of my edicts, if you will, is I want everyone to have as high marks as possible. It's not my my thinking that I want to make you suffer or anything like that. It's not about that for me. For me, it's about learning, right? So I want to make sure you get the maximum learning from our course. That's the most important part. And so you get a couple of attempts. So one of the reasons is technical issues. If you have a problem with you're online and something happens and whatever, you lose connectivity for whatever reason and you can't continue your quiz, something screws up on eCentennial or whatever, I don't want that to be something that limits you, A. And B, sometimes you answered wrong and there's a chance that you can answer correctly the next time. I don't mind about that. I think it's good. You'll have a chance to go through the material a couple times, which means you'll know it a little bit more intimately, and that's great. I think going through the material, there's some really good material here, and you'll get to know the material a little better. I think it's a good thing. It supplements your learning, and so this is all good for me, right? That's my motivation behind these, and especially you getting 2 attempts. So any questions around the quiz? Again, it's open now. You can do it between now, although I don't recommend it now. I recommend you wait till 6:30 or so to start. Anytime between now and Friday at midnight, okay? One thing I have to tell you, Petra, do me a favor. Can you let's see if we can talk after, and I'll make sure that you get taken care of. Okay. And I got your email. Yes. Okay. So one thing that I also want you guys to think about when it comes to the quiz itself, I want you to remember that there's going to be no extensions. So Friday at midnight is the day that it is the time and date that it's due, and it's a quiz, so it's kind of like a take-home test. You have had all these days to get it done. There's no excuses really not to get it done. So my expectation is for you guys that you'll get the quiz done before Friday. Okay, so there may be extraneous circumstances that prevent people from getting it done, like week-long sickness or something crazy. Hopefully not. I wish everyone health and well-being, of course. But sometimes things happen, and there's extraneous circumstances. Only in those cases will I allow an extension for people who have issues. Okay, but for the most part, I recommend you start right away. As soon as we're done here, get it done. It's 10 minutes, and it gives you a chance to get your marks pretty much right away because it's an online quiz. Okay. Questions around the quiz, other than accessibility questions that I would ask. Okay, and like we said, some people had problems with their installation, which we'll try and handle. So before we start, so this is the PowerPoint today. We want to handle all these things. Again, am I going to go through every slide in the PowerPoint? The answer is no. That's for you guys to go through to look at the PowerPoint and so on, and I think that's a good thing. I'm going to use the PowerPoint as a guide, which basically make sure we handle all the key points on the PowerPoint, so that way when you do your quiz next week, or when you do the quiz this week, or even for your understanding, then I think you'll have a good basis for what we're doing. Okay, so that's why I'm using the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is not something that I'm going to read through. Typically, I'm going to use it as a guide. Okay. On to getting going here. So remember last week we did our little install. There is one thing I want to show you a little differently today, and I know some people have been having some networking issues and so on. One thing is, if you had a local network and you wanted to connect to a local network through your Linux machine, you're going to find you're going to have a problem. Okay, so let me explain this for you in a second. So this is a watch. You watch and then we'll do together kind of thing. So if I click start, all right, and again, start in my VM means I'm starting up my VM. If the assumption is right now, I'm gonna use this. I'm using this kind of scaled mode so you can see it a little better. For you, you don't have to do this. I'm doing it so that you guys have a better view, so I can make the VM as large as I need to, right? But for you, you don't have to do this. It's not required. Okay, so VM is kicking off. It's loading. It's just as if I was running it on the metal right now, for the most part. Remember last week what we did was we allocated a couple of cores, and I allocated some memory to it. Remember that these things can be optimized in your host system. So that means my system. And I want to give you some specs for this thing so you understand. If my system is running faster than yours or something, remember that yours may not be configured like mine. Okay, here I am at the startup. I'm going to put my password in, and there we go. We're going to start off. It's going to launch. If yours is faster than mine, hooray! That's awesome. I'm really happy for you. However, if yours is deathly slower than mine, right? It could be because you haven't had a chance to, you haven't been able to allocate as many resources as me. And your system, your host system may have a lower configuration, and I mean lower as in like lesser than mine, which might be possible, very possible for you. So a couple things to note is I'm running an Intel 8th generation i9 processor. Okay, so that's one thing that I'm running with, right? So an i9 is slightly better in the mobile device from an i7, I would say. From a specs perspective, my processor has the ability to be overclocked. Okay, so that way if I want to make it faster and have a higher clock speed, I can do that. It gets a little hot when I do that, and it also, to some degree, deteriorates the fabric of the processor over time. I don't know if that is 100% true, but I always feel like when you overclock stuff, it's hotter, heat, not a good thing for the processor. But I run it this way because I run multiple programs all at the same time, and I also play games. Right, so that's one thing I do. Remember, I'm also a gaming professor, so that's what I do a lot with students. So that's one thing. So that's my processor. I have 32 gigabytes of memory available to me to allocate. and I've allocated 4. I could allocate more. My processor has multiple cores. I think it has 8 cores, if I'm not wrong. So I could certainly allocate more than one to my VM. Remember, what you're doing with the VM is you're allocating resources, hardware resources, that the VM will be sharing with your system. So a good example of that is if I give it 1 core, then I'm going to have only 1 core available from a process perspective. So when it comes to multi-threading, multitasking, all that kind of stuff, 1 core is okay if you're not doing too much of that. But once you start going into other more taxing things in your guest system inside the VM, then it always helps to have multiple cores allocated if you can spare them. And what I mean by that is if you have a multi-core configuration on your hardware, your host hardware. Okay, so host hardware meaning, my system here. And also, the more memory you allocate, obviously, the better it's going to operate if there's a lot of programs running at the same time. Now, for this, chances are we're not going to have a lot going on here yet, but that's part of it. But one of the challenges we have right now is the network is a little bit in a cage. And let me show you this for a second. So if I go to Activities, and by the way, there's a couple ways to get there. Remember, we can just click on the Activities link at the top, or press the Windows button, which also brings up the window. Alt F1 also brings up the window on a Windows machine. I believe it's Option F1 on a Mac, because Alt and Option usually are interchangeable on a Mac. Alt F2 allows me to run a command automatically, so that's one thing I can do. But Alt F1 or the Windows button allows me to do this. Okay, so that's kind of something we can do. So if I press the Window button now, I can go over here to the left, and you can see that I have my file manager. Okay, there's my file manager. File manager actually has a name that we're going to get into later on. So when I bring up the file manager here, you can see that I have, kind of talks about my current location. If I hover over any of the locations here, it actually tells you the directory. We talked about directories last week. So this is showing you home, Tom, documents. Home being my home directory, Tom, home directory of the system, Tom being my profile directory, and documents being the folder or directory that my documents are sitting in. If I click there should be nothing in there because we haven't put anything in there. Downloads is where I've been downloading stuff. You can see that I had my code, Visual Studio Code was downloaded here in Downloads, right, as an example. And there's a couple ways to get rid of stuff. You can simply just click there and press delete, or you can just drag it to the trash, and that would move, kind of anything that you've got in Downloads to the trash. Trash is like the same thing as the recycle bin in a Windows machine, and you can restore it or you can empty the trash like normal. So anything you hover over here in your File Explorer or your File Manager, if you will, you can see that it tells you the directory and the operating system of where these things are. This is very useful. So this is, if you don't know where the actual things are, here they are. Okay. But what about other locations? If I click on other locations, it's going to look at the networks. And you notice I have this Windows network here that comes up and doesn't show me anything. It says the folder's empty from the Windows network. And a lot of times people have issues with this. If I want to see a computer on my network, it has to be sharing, it has to be on the same network. The problem is I'm not on the same network. My computer right now, which is in Windows, the host system, and my computer, which is on the guest system, which is Linux, are on 2 different subnets. Okay, so that's a real issue. So we need to fix this in order for us to see stuff. So on the top right, notice that I have, it says wired connection, right? And it says I can go to wired settings and I can fool around with the settings, monkey around with the settings here. I can certainly try that. That is on the guest operating system, and that's not really going to help me too much. I mean, I could do some configuration on the guest system, but what we want to do instead is I want to power down. So let's do this now. I want to power down or power off this thing altogether. Okay, it's power off. Again, we're trying to do this as gently and gracefully as possible so that we don't damage the VM. It's important to try and do this, right? And now we're back to this. Notice I also have this other, VM that I have here as kind of a test VM, and I have another one as a backup that I saved last week. And I also told you that saving your VM as a backup is a good idea, just in case your VM blows up and then you can't do your work. That would be a bad thing. Although installation doesn't take all that long, it's still a waste of your time. So what we want to do is, if you want to scroll down to where it says network and click onto it once, it'll bring up your network configuration. And notice as it says NAT. And this is okay. And what it's doing is it's creating almost like this, it's a network adapter setting that allows you to pass through the current network and create almost like a little subnet for itself, as an example. And the subnet's usually 10 dot something. Okay. Now my local computer, my host computer, right, which is my machine here. Let's just bring up the console. So I'm going to bring up the terminal window on my local machine. This is my actual host machine here. Command prompt. Obviously, it's Windows machine here, right? If I issue an ipconfig command, you can see that ipconfig, which is the Windows command for my network, shows me my local IP address. This is not going to matter to you because locally this is it. Here's my IPv6 address and so on. But here's my local IP address, 192.168.56.1. Okay? And that's going to be a different address than my address in the VM, right? So what I want, and there's a couple ways to do this. One way to make it simple for yourself is click on that. This is where your VM is unpowered. And you can choose bridged adapter. Okay, bridged adapter, which means we're going to share the same adapter, with the VM. Okay, so notice it says which one do I want to share. I have two. I have a gigabit Ethernet adapter, my controller, which is a physical plug on my system because I'm wired right now, or I can choose my wireless adapter. That's also something I can choose, so I can bridge that one. Okay, so depending which one I want, I can kind of use either the same one I'm using, which is the wired adapter, or the wireless adapter. If you don't have something plugged into the wired adapter, this would be dumb to do, because that means that, well, it's not going to go anywhere, and you're not going to have access to anything. But I have both, so I'm just going to use this one, right? And then I'm going to click OK. That's it. Literally, I just changed it from from NAT to bridged. And notice it says it's using the adapter 1 now is going to be using my bridged adapter. Okay, now if I run it, let's see what the difference is between this and that. Now here, why am I bringing this up? Some people have said, well, I want to use my Linux machine as a server. I want to run a web server or whatever. How do I do that, and how can it be seen as an example by my local system? Well, the only way that it's going to be seen by your local system is if you do something that allows you to either change a subnet. You can do it inside the guest machine. I'm doing it on the host side. We're going to do it again later on, because you have total control of Linux when it comes to your adapter settings and so on later on. But here, what I'm hoping to do is, if I bridge, I'm going to have the same IP range, right? I'm using the same adapter, but I'm using a bridge adapter. So I'm spoofing or simulating having the same connection, the same hardware as my host operating system. So here I'm logging in again, and now I've got a different way of connecting. As opposed to me using a NAT, I'm using a different way of connecting through the router. I'm now bridged. Okay, so let's see what the difference is. So I'm going to go here, and again, what I want to go to is my file system. Here's my file manager. Okay, and now I want to click other locations and see what I get. Now notice that it's scanning my network, and now we got all kinds of stuff. I got like my son's laptop, my server 1, which is my media server. I've got my TV Mac, different things, all kind of different networks, right? So that's interesting, yeah. I think this is a different situation than what I had before. And when I go to Windows Network, obviously the folder's still empty, but that I get something in other locations where I got nothing before, right? I got nothing before, right? So that gives you a sense that I'm on the same subnet now than compared to what I was before, okay? So that's something that you may want to explore doing if you're having problems, connectivity problems, when you can't connect and so on. Now, one thing we need to do is still try and make sure that we can connect to the internet, and I'm pretty positive that'll be no problem. Let's suppose I go to Chrome, and let's see some terrible news for the day. I'm just going to go to news.google.com, sure. And if I get news for today, there we go, George Floyd, terrible news happened on the internet. We've been noticed. So this is a modern thing. You'll see the weather. I can check also weather network just to see what that looks like. So I can type in the weather network and I can get some, I can make sure that I'm getting, kind of connectivity right out of my VM. Yeah, George Floyd is a terrible situation. Unfortunately, it's not really the topic of this course, but if you haven't had a chance to look into that, take a look. It's something that needs to change globally. Okay, so that is here, and that's how we do it. So you should have the same capabilities as me, all right, at this point. Is it necessary to do this? It's not necessary. However, one of the things that that you want to try and do sometimes, like I said, is share your web server. If I create a web server here, and maybe one of the things we'll be doing this semester is doing that, creating a little web server or whatever, then how can you connect to this thing unless you know the IP address and so on, right? And we'll talk about how to find the IP address of this thing, like with commands. Okay, right. Today it's not really that important. I just want to talk about if you're having connectivity issues. That's one of the things that can solve the connectivity issues, especially if you want to look at your network and you're like, wait, I don't see my network. Maybe you have a home network that you have access to, or you want to have your VM access some files, or even you want to have your VM access your other machine. Maybe you have another machine or a local machine, you want to have access to that stuff, and you're sharing, then you want to make sure that you're on the same network, and you won't be without making some configuration changes to the VM unless you do something like what I did. Okay? So it's not necessary, but it might help, is what I'm saying. Okay? All right, so now we know this is true, and I want to start by talking about the terminal a little bit. And we're going to learn a lot of what we do with Linux is we do on the terminal. Okay? Again, we can do a couple things with the terminal window. Whenever we have the terminal window up, or any window, if I press, Alt and again, if I'm looking at this kind of window, if I press my Windows button and then press the right arrow, then it's going to move to the right. Left arrow, move to the left. It'll maximize. Down arrow, it'll make it restored. And up arrow, it'll maximize to the screen. It's up to you how you want to work. I like working in terminal like this. One thing to notice is the person that's logged in, right? So if you notice here, it's Tom at localhost. Tom at localhost. That is the user that's in. And if I say who, right, it'll show who's logged in on which terminal, Tom. If I say who am I and press enter, you can see Tom, that's who I am, right? So try that. You should see that's one of the first commands you should learn, kind of doing the who command. So who's logged in, and then who am I, right? I think those are kind of very simple commands. And remember, we talked about this earlier in this course, which is we're going to be doing a lot of little commands that you're going to have to remember as part of your quiz. Yes, Kervin, sorry, you had a question. Go ahead. You want to type your question? Worst case, you can always turn your mic on and ask the question, and I can try and answer it for you. I tried to install Visual Studio on my Linux, but when I tried to open it, it says unable to open archive. Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code? Because Visual Studio would be impossible. Yeah, Visual Studio would be impossible for you to download properly on Linux unless you're downloading Visual Studio for Linux. Visual Studio Code is different than Visual Studio. So again, if I was to try and download, let's just try that. If I go to home here and I say, download Visual Studio by itself, right, just like that for Linux. And if I go, it says Windows and Mac. If I look at for Linux, does Visual Studio for Linux exist? Right, so Visual Studio Code does, and then, but not Visual Studio. So that's the one thing. All right, so Visual Studio will definitely not run. I've never seen it run for anything but Windows and Mac, and the Mac version of Visual Studio is nowhere near the same quality or has the same features as Visual Studio for Windows. Okay. Visual Studio Code, however, is a totally different thing. You can't run, one thing that I got to tell you that you can't do, you cannot run Windows specific applications on Linux, right? Because they use something called a .exe. It's an executable extension that only works in Windows, whereas Mac and Linux operating systems will use a different way of installing and running your code, which we'll talk about as the course progresses. Okay, so that's one thing. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so just want to hit the PowerPoint here to make sure we're on track. So one thing is, we talked about this idea of an operating system that connects users and application programs and programmers to a bunch of peripherals. We have hardware, CPU, monitor, keyboard, blah blah, and that's normal whether it's whether it has to deal with when you're working with Linux or whether you're working on a Mac or a Windows machine. Okay, so so there's different kinds of operating systems we talked about last week. This is all the stuff that we kind of a review. One thing we just talked about is this idea of a network. All of our PCs typically are networked together at school, as a good example. So you can connect to the network and share a printer or other devices. A lot of times we also, if we're on the same local area network, LAN, then we're also able to share resources. For example, if I make a web server, which is what I've been talking about just for the last 5 minutes, on a Linux box, right, and I want to share it with Windows, then what I can do is I can use the Linux server or workstation even as a server. I can go in there and run, let's say something like Nginx, which would be a web server, and then I can go and run a web page or something like that on the system, and I can access it from outside of the Linux box. Because remember, right now, before when we were NAT, we're kind of in a cage, right? Now that we've kind of sharing or bridging adapters, we're outside the cage. Now we have access to the actual box through the local IP address that we've assigned. It's automatically generated through my router, right? And your router would do the same thing. It'll generate automatically generate an IP address that it serves up to the VM and allows it to use that IP address. Now, what is an IP address? For those people who don't know, you should know about this. Of course, it's a way of connecting, or it's a grouping of numbers or octals, right? That basically allows you to access a particular machine or network or device or appliance, and usually it starts with like 3 digits, typically. Sometimes internally you might have an internal IP address that starts with something like 10, and it's separated by dots. So it's like got 4 octals, right? So example, local networks like mine and maybe the ones you have at home are 192.168. This is like a local network, and it usually starts with 2 or 1, depending on the router settings that you have in there, and then followed by the subnet mask of whatever you're using. Typically it's like something like between anywhere from 1 to 255. Typically the higher end numbers aren't used because they're reserved. So that's how it usually goes, and you want to match those two things when it comes to networking. We're going to talk about a little bit of networking later on. So we have our server, the idea that we have a server and we have a bunch of clients on the same network, and what we do is we connect to the server and share files, and that's how it used to be done we talked about this last week as a way of, kind of utilizing resources in the best way possible. For example, if we have a killer, crazy printer that I've spent, let's say, thousands of dollars on, imagine if everyone had this thousands of dollars printer, right? So I have a multifunction color printer, let's say, and I want to, I want people to share it. Then I share it across the network, and then everyone has access to it because, guess what? I'm probably not going to be printing nonstop all the time. That's me. And if I was, then maybe it's valuable for me to have my own printer. But chances are, I'm going to share it with everybody else in the network. Shared printer. And we talked about the advantages of Linux. I'm not going to go into that again. And when it was created, this is all stuff from last time. One thing to note is, question I had was POSIX. It's kind of an organization that is, what they do is they're making this committee that's coming together to standardize Unix. So one thing that I had to question, what's POSIX? Well, here's where it is. The other one was different kinds of, from a high-level concept perspective, we have the hardware layer, and then we have our Unix or Linux kernel, and on top of that we have several different kinds of shells. A shell will be, just like we saw before, some kind of terminal, and there's different versions we talked about last week. This is all review from last week. And then users access the shell, which gives them access to the operating system kernel and ultimately to the hardware, right? That's how we make things do. So again, we've talked about different kinds of Linux at a high level, but here I'm just mentioning here some of the most popular ones: Debian, Fedora, and Debian's more of GNU Linux. Fedora, Red Hat Linux, OpenSUSE, and Ubuntu. And again, my favorites probably, I have to tell you, are probably Fedora and Ubuntu. Maybe Ubuntu being the easiest one to use for me. Right, it's got a really nice shell. A UI as well. Very nice. So it talks about what a shell is. It's a program that interprets commands, so it's a command line interface. That's what it is. And there's also the graphic user interface. These are all things we covered last day. And some more pictures. And you can choose different shells. If you had multiple little programs that allowed you to access the network. For example, if I'm typically in a bash shell, which is what's a default for Fedora Linux, and if I want to move to another type of shell that I have installed, I have to have this installed, and I have to type in CSH or TCSH or ZSH, and I can move into another type of shell environment that has other options and that presents my commands slightly differently. It's something that I might feel more comfortable doing, especially if I'm working in an environment at work that uses a particular shell, and I want to match it when I'm working remotely at home. A lot of times you want familiarity, so that's why we use different shells and also different capabilities, because every shell has different utility programs that are a lot of times attached to it. And it talks about how to switch from shell to shell here, which we haven't had a chance to do. There's also some common ways to access Linux, and one of them is Telnet, okay, as well as SSH and others, dumb terminals and so on. But typically, Telnet or SSH are the easiest way to do it. SSH is actually built into your, and Telnet as well, into your Linux system. So there's nothing for you to download or use. Okay, so that's one way we can do it. We can use SSH commands to get in. And you can also use, if I want to log in, as long as I have an account, if I want to log into your workstation, and this is something we can try at some point, I have an account on your workstation and I have your IP address, and I can tunnel through your router to your machine. I can log in and access files on your workstation as long as you've given me access to do so. Okay, so remember that multiple users can have access to the same resources, hardware resources on your machine, because Linux from the ground up was made as a multi-user environment as opposed to a single-user environment like most Windows machines. Okay. So that's just all review from last week. Here's an example of an IP address. Again, here's 172.16.1.61. Each of the elements of the IP address is a very high level. We're going to talk about this later on. These are octals. Anything that is separated here by the dots. So 172, kind of that's like the high level or outside address, right? and then 16.1.61. This is all something that can be defined or filtered by your subnet mask. All right. So we either use this when we kind of connect to a domain, specific IP address, or we use a domain name, fully qualified domain, which is like, for example, research.campus.edu. Right. That's something that we can use to connect. So a good idea would be something like, I'm going to use the SSH command, and then I want to connect to my, as an example, my my username you put the symbol, and then the host name, and that's the kind of the general form that you use to connect to others. So again, what I mean by this is, if we go back to our VM, here's our VM. So I'm logging in again because VM just logged me. If I just type in SSH and press enter, it kind of tells you the same thing. It says, hey, you need to bind the address to something, right? You must have, some kind of IP address. That's what it's looking for, with a destination, right? So again, there's several commands you can use here. Now remember what my IP address was on my host system. Here's a connectivity test you can use. So if I go to my host system again, and I type in command, and I type in ipconfig, right? ipconfig on the host Windows system now, okay? If I type it in, you can see that my local command is 192.168.56.1, all right? And with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.250, what this means is the first, groupings of octals, 255.255.255, means ignore everything. So I can't make a change to this. The only thing that's modifiable or that's, alterable in this type of subnet mask is the last digit. The rest, it uses binary addition, and it gets rid of or ignores the other digits altogether. So the one that we're looking for to change every single time is the last octal. And what this means is that you'll have numbers that change here from 1 to 255, where 255 is the maximum and 0 is the minimum. But we normally don't start with 0. Okay, so that's how it works. So now this is my IP address. That means if I want to connect to this, I can try and do a command, right? A couple commands to do this. So one of the commands that are typical is the ping command. So if I say ping, and if I press enter, normally on a Windows machine, you're going to see this. Now it says, hey, ping, usage error, destination address is required. So ping, what it does is it creates a connectivity test. That's all it does. It says, I want to send a message from my one computer to the other computer, all right? And this message is basically going to go back and forth, and it's going to say, I want to wait to see if I can get a response. I'm sending a request out saying, do you exist? And I'm going to get a response back saying, yes, I do, or no, I don't, okay? And no, I don't means I'm not going to get a response, because it's not going to say I don't exist. If you don't exist, you don't exist. You don't respond, right? So let's try this out. So if I say ping 192.168.56.1 and press enter, then what I'm hoping is I'm going to get a response, right? Notice what's happening here. It's trying. That's what's happening here. It's trying. And then if I don't get a response, it's going to return an error, right? Or it's just going to be locked up like this, right? Notice I'm not getting a response. I'm just saying I'm pinging, right? But nothing's happening. Why? Because my local machine is probably a firewall on that's preventing my, this thing from connecting. That's what's happening. But notice it didn't also come back with an error, right? The way to stop any command is Control-C, right? Control-C will stop. Notice it says 0 received, 100% packet loss. This means that I tried to send packets out to that IP address, 192.168.56.1, but it wasn't working. Why? Because our Windows machines are pretty secure, actually, for the average user. I got to qualify it with that. And what that means is that it's going to, kind of ignore those kind of things until or unless I, kind of open up the firewall locally, which I don't recommend, and allow myself to ping across the network. Okay, so this is one thing that Windows machines will stop from happening, right? And it never used to be like that. It used to be available for you to ping as much as you want. In fact, the latest versions of Windows 10 operating system doesn't even allow you to look at the local network, like or kind of the discovery part of Windows has been turned off, and you have to spend some extra time turning that on if you really wanted to kind of look at your entire network. Okay, so that's one thing that is the case. So even though the command is there, we can try and ping our network, and pinging again is just, do I have connectivity? Right here you can see that I was unsuccessful. Okay, so that's something that I wanted to mention. So even though we're on the same subnet, it doesn't matter. My lovely Windows machine is just going to say, nope, I don't know who you are. I'm not going to take a risk and respond. Maybe nothing's wrong with yours. Yours may just have not, if you're using the same kind of commands and it's working for you, that's awesome. The reason why it may not work for me is because, my settings are a little different than yours, right? So don't worry about it. If it worked, that's an indication that you're not blocking when it comes to, you're not blocking the ping from your machine, and that's totally fine. So for me, it didn't work. Notice 192.168.56.1 is what my local IP, my IPv4 address is, right? Now, this is interesting. Even though I'm looking at it, there's two addresses that I have here. So this is one of them. So notice it says my VirtualBox host only network. That's interesting. And here's the other one, 192.168.2.53. That's different. And I also have a default gateway. Maybe what I did was I pinged the wrong IP address. Let's try that again. So ping 192.168. Maybe my network is not as configured as I thought. .53, and now we should see a response, right? Hopefully it's not going to crap out as much as it did before. Actually, it looks like it's the same response. And I'm getting 100% packet loss here too. Even though you can clearly see that I've got these two IP addresses here, it doesn't really matter, right? Why? Because I'm blocking. Okay. So that's how you can see. See, it's 100% packet loss, and you may have a different result than I do. But definitely, that's how IP addresses work. You want to try and ping and serve this up. Now it says this is my host only network, 192.168.56.1, and what is my network here? So one thing to do is, if you're getting really messy here on the command line, there is a clear command you can use. If you type in the word clear and press enter, it clears the screen for you. Okay, so that's how you can do it. So again, if I type the word ifconfig, right? Ifconfig is like ipconfig, right? So let's take a look here and see what my network address is. It says it can actually tell you some information about your loopback IP. So this is your loopback address. Loopback is your local host, 127.0.0.1. And then it says Ethernet 0. There's your Ethernet 0. And you can see that my local Ethernet address, right? My virtual address, my virtual IP address is 192.168.2.60. That's the IP address that my my network has produced for me. So my router, right, has given me, kind of through automatic, addressing, and I'll talk about that different type of addressing that we're talking about. It's given me an IP address of 192.168.2.60 for this machine here. Okay, for this machine. So that means for my virtual machine. Okay. Let's see if I can ping it from my Windows machine. So again, I'm just going to go into my command prompt here, and I'm going to see if I can ping it. So I'm going to do the same thing. So again, for Windows, it's a CLS command to clear. So CLS, and I'm going to say ping, and then the IP address 192.168.2.60, and that's the IP address of my virtual machine. Right? Let's see if that works. If I press enter, and you can see that I'm getting a reply. That's what I was hoping to get from my my Windows machine, right? Notice that it says time to live. That's what TTL is. Time to live is 64 milliseconds, and it told you the response time. Notice the response time is less than 1 millisecond response time. That's because I'm on the same network. If I was going to ping an IP address that's somewhere else, then the response time might be way longer, and the number of trips and hops and all that stuff would be way higher. So right now we're looking at a very small response time, which makes sense because I'm pinging one machine from the other machine, right? So that's kind of the way it works. So pinging this way, going from my guest to my host, for me, not a problem, right? From my host to my guest, not a problem. From my guest to my host, a problem, because my host is blocking, right? And I've done that because of my firewall. Okay, so I'm not going to disable that right now. That's just showing you how it works. Okay, so the command that I used was ifconfig, ifconfig. Okay, we're going to talk about this command later on, but if ever you have any kind of connectivity issues or something that you want to know what your IP address is for your virtual machine, you can certainly find it here. Okay, let's try something else now. Let's power this down, right, one more time. And I'm going to go and switch it back. Okay, so let's try this out. So switch, power log off, power off, right? I'm going to power off everything, go back, and turn it back on again. You could also try and restart. But I want to power off because I want to change the settings again back to this other stuff. All right, let's try this out. So again, here I am, and I want to go back to the network. I want to click on the network. This is on my local machine, and I want to go back to NAT. Okay. By the way, there's another option that we can try later on, which is NAT network. Okay, we're going to try that in a second too. But let's go to NAT for a second and see what the result is for this, and click Start. Okay. So when we do this, we're going to start up our virtual machine again, and it's going to have its own IP address. Remember how we did it? What's the command? Ifconfig. So it's ipconfig on a Windows machine, but on a Linux machine or a Mac, right? It's ifconfig. That's the command, right? You should be able to see connectivity. So the idea here is that you can see connectivity between one machine and another. All right, that's what I wonder. It doesn't really do anything. Pinging is something that is used often, to detect connectivity. I have connection. It's usually a hardware connection that I can make between one machine and another, or a software connection. All right, so here we go. We're logging in, and we're going to do the same command here, right? Hey, let's try that Alt F2 command when it comes up, instead of the going into my terminal. Let's press Alt F2 and type a command. Just type in ifconfig here and press enter and see what happens, right? Does it actually do anything? Well, actually it did do something, but what's happened is the response is gone because it opens and closes automatically. So that's why we need a terminal. So if I go back here and if I go ifconfig and press enter, you can see now that, hey, look, my IP address has changed, right? Changed to the point where 10.0.2.15 and where it broadcasts, there is no way I can connect to this. And if you tried this, let's say I tried this thing, so I said, okay, let us ping from the Windows machine now 10.0.2.15. Those are the 4 octals that I'm pinging. That's the address for my machine, this machine here, right? If I press enter here and press enter, you're going to see that I'm going to get no response. My Windows machine is going to time out. It's going to try 4 times, and it's going to keep on timing out. And then finally, when it finishes timing out, it's going to stop. Okay? That's typically how it works for a Windows machine. Make sense? There we go. Those are 4 times. We've sent 4 packets. We've got 100% packet loss on the other side. Why? Because this IP address is not within the same range as my local machine. My local machine is not on the same network anymore. Questions around this? This is an important understanding when it comes to your network, because one of the things we want to talk about right away is, and I always get questions around this when we ever set up a machine. Professor, I don't know how, but I can't connect to my machine. I can't map drives. I can't do all this kind of stuff. How do I do it? Why is this not working? Well, here's why it's not working, because you're on a different network altogether. Okay. Yours is not bridged, but it worked. Awesome. I'm glad that you can make it work. For me, it's not going to work. Maybe it's my configuration compared to yours, and that's great. But yours should probably work how mine is working, if yours is configured like mine. All right, let's try it again. So again, I'm going to go back to my VM. I'm going to power down, and let's see what happens. Again, these are just very basic commands we're doing. We're just changing the configuration on the outside, which changes the configuration on the inside. Okay. Remember that my adapter is my virtual adapter, this thing that looks like a network on the inside, it's trying to figure out you know, its IP address, and it's being given an IP address to my host machine. Let's try it again, and instead of NAT, let's try NAT network and see what that does. Now it says name not selected. That's okay, right? But there's also an advanced tab that we can use. It says adapter. I can choose an adapter that I want to use that's compatible. I can make it look like a particular adapter, right? If I want to, or I can just not. It'll just do it on its own, and press OK. Notice that invalid settings detected. It says, I don't know what you're talking about, Tom, is what it's saying. It says, because, you know what? Even though I'm trying to do it, network doesn't make any sense, right? You can see that that's the truth, right? So that is something that's not working. I can also put not attached. Host only adapter, right? So there's my host only adapter where it says VirtualBox host only. Let's see what we get there when we do that, and press OK. I want to try different settings here. Again, I'm going to restart my virtual machine to get this done. Can I do it live? Okay, can I do it live? Can I switch my settings in my virtual machine when I'm live? Yes, sometimes you can. Do I recommend that? No, I don't. Okay, so power down, you know, for 1 second. Go back in. If you have a decent machine, it shouldn't take long for you to log back in. As you can see, hasn't taken long for me to get back in and out of my virtual machine. Okay, why am I showing you this? Later on, my friends, we're going to need to know it, and you need to know how to use it. And I'm just introducing a little bit of command line stuff. The commands, what are they? The command that I'm putting in, ipconfig on the PC and ifconfig on a Mac, is it really a command? What do you think? What am I really doing when I'm typing in that config? So if I go here to me, and I log in now, and I'm going to run my terminal window, what is really happening when I'm running a command? What is a command? Well, a command, if you think about it, is a program that's running, right? I've got a little utility program that I'm accessing by its name, and it's on the path, right? So I can access that command, right? So again, if I go back down to here, and if I pull this up, and now if I try it out again, let's try ifconfig and see what I get. Do I get any difference? Do I have an IP address? Take a look at this one now. Okay, this is interesting. I got this new IP address, 192.168.56.101. Okay, and it says that if I do an ipconfig here, so ipconfig, you can see that I've got 192.168.56.1. 192.168.56.101. Okay, that's interesting. Maybe, do I have a chance to ping my host? Do you think it's possible, or do you think I'm going to get the same challenge? Let's try this out. So again, I'm going to clear this, and I'm going to go ping 192.168.56.1, right, and see what I get now. I mean, I'm picking my internal host. I should have no problem connecting, and yet I have the same problem. Why? Because my machine is blocking, right? And sometimes you will. In order for me to stop blocking, I had to turn my firewall off, or make an exception to my firewall that allows this connectivity to work, right? Because what's happening is my firewall is blocking, and you might have this problem throughout the time we're running the course. So I'm just letting you know that even if it makes sense and if it doesn't work, like for me, it's because my firewall is blocking. Okay, and I can Control C gets me out of it. And now let's see if I can ping the other way, because I have an IP address that's the same. So can I do it the same way? Can I say ping 192.168, and let's make sure we have the proper IP address. So ifconfig to give us the IP address, right? We can see that's up here in the second line here. It says 192.168.56.101. Let's try this out. So 56.101, and press enter. And do I get a response? Yes, I am. I'm getting a response again. Here's something else though. This is connectivity between these two, the host and the guest, but what about the ability for me to tunnel out? So if I go back to, oops, wrong one. If I go back to here to files, right, and I go to other locations now, can I see my outside network? Notice that I cannot, right? So before, when I changed my IP address to 192.168.2, whatever it was, 2 dot whatever, then yes, I was able to see my entire network. But here, because I'm limiting it to this network here between my computer, my host, and my guest, the only thing I can see is if I always open up my firewall, my host machine, but I couldn't see outside of it. Okay? So I'm just letting you know this is how it works. So one more time. I'm just going to go back, right, and change it back to my. Now, if it worked for you, some people are like, it worked for me. Okay, well, it worked for you. That's awesome. It's not supposed to work. It's supposed to be blocked if it's outside your IP address, but it really depends on your configuration. That's the answer. So let me just power off, right? Power off, and then I'm going to come back. I'm going to put NAT bridged connection, which is back on. Then I'll be able to see my entire network again. And I can access things like movies and pictures and other files and so on in my network if I wanted to share that, as well as my printer if I want to set up my printer. And we'll talk about that, right? So, or if I wanted to look at my my router, if I want to see my router and want to get connected to my router, this is another way to do it. So now I'm going to go back to network, and so you can make it look like it's I'm going to go back to bridge adapter, right? There it is. Again, I'm using my killer gigabit Ethernet controller, right? Not my wireless controller, right? Here it is. And then press OK. And then press start. And that should allow me to bridge again between my machine, my Linux machine, which is the VM, and the outside world with the same IP address range as my host machine, which allows me to see the other parts of my system. Now, if you're really worried, and if you're doing something challenging, and maybe you want to isolate your Linux machine, leave it as is. Leave it how it was before. You won't be able to kind of access it. But if I want to use my Linux machine as a web server for those people who are interested in doing that kind of thing, you need to put it on the same IP range as your local network. And in my case, it's 192.168.2. whatever. Okay, that's what I wanted to show you there. What happens when we click on wireless adapter instead of Ethernet? Nothing. If you have both and you're connected to both your, if you have something plugged into wireless, or to wired, you're okay. But if you have no wired connection, for example, you're not wired directly to your router, well, then you're not going to have that option, or A, or B, it won't work because it's an empty socket. You haven't plugged a wire into it. Here, I've plugged a wire directly from my computer to my host network. Okay, so so that's why I'm able to do what I'm doing. Okay. Yay! Okay, so we're back in, and again, if I go back to here, and if I go to files, and if I look at other locations now, I'm going to see more computers on my network, like we did before. Why? Because all these computers are, computers that are file sharing, as an example, or open up files. Here's my server 1. I have a computer locally called server 1 that I use for movies and so on, and it's asking me to log in because I've passworded it, and you should too if you have something local. And I'm not going to put my password in there for you guys to see that, but that's how it is. So I have a little server running on my network. One thing to note also is, before I move on to other things, is my home network, I have my entire house is wired. So what I've done is, not only when I was involved with setting up my house network, I was able to put things in like a wired network through my entire house, and there's straight runs that go right down to my router, which is provided by my service provider, right? So I have Cat6 Ethernet cables running through my house, so I can connect nicely. And I have an option of connecting wirelessly, of course, through the wireless network that I have in my house too. And I have several, right? So why have I done this? Because I want to have connectivity. I want to be able to plug in a Rogers box or a Bell box or whatever directly into my network and not use the wireless. So when it comes to streaming things like Netflix, or if I want to look at Prime Video or any channel that I want on the network, it's going to have good performance, and I'm not going to, kind of lose connectivity. Okay. Yay, so that's lesson number 1 when it comes to connecting between your machine your host machine and your guest machine. Okay. Something that we're going to use later on, but I want to talk about today because I think this is going to be something that you're going to have challenges with when we talk about other kinds of commands. Okay, let's go back to the command window here. So again, going back to terminal, all my commands happen in here. And again, the commands we talked about, we looked at who is. We also looked at ifconfig today, which is not on your PowerPoint, and a bunch of other ones we're going to look at in a second. Let's take a look at others. So this is the way you would tunnel to another system. So for example, if I was to, kind of log in to another system, and I have another system I'm going to try, right? I have my Mac, right? And I'm just gonna, my Mac is also on my network, right? So let's just bring that up. I'm going to see if I can do that here. So let's try this out for you. One thing I'm going to do for you, and there's a little program that you can use. I'm wondering if it's going to work. I'm just going to clean up my Mac so you don't have to see any kind of garbaggio. But I want you to see what my Mac will look like, and I'm going to use a little program to show you this called TeamViewer. So here's my TeamViewer. I'm going to bring up my TeamViewer here on my machine. Again, you can also use Chrome Desktop. Like remote desktop, but here you can see I have my daughter's machine, I have my MacBook Pro and my TV Mac. Let's get into my MacBook Pro. I'm just showing you this. This is nothing for you to do right now. All right, just watch. So I'm getting into my MacBook Pro, and if everything goes well, and if TeamViewer says I'm okay, and I'm not trying to use their stuff wrong or whatever, then you can see now I have access to my Mac. So here's my MacBook Pro, and here is my command prompt, right? So in my command prompt, just like it was on the Linux machine, I can put in ifconfig, and it's going to show me my IP address. So if I go all the way to the top here, just like I did last time, it's going to show me in a very similar way, right? Because remember that we're using Darwin Linux, a version of the kernel that's slightly different. It's going to show me my IP address, and you can see my IP address is 192.168.2.51 on my system. I've got a couple of different IP addresses. One that's part of the wireless, as an example, and there's another one that's actually wired, and it'll tell you which one's which depending on the type of signals and stuff that you're going to get. Now, I want to connect between my I want to do a ping test between my host machine first. So that's my Windows machine. Okay, so this is my ping test. Here we go. Between my Windows machine and my Mac. All right, so let's see if that works. So if I say ping 192.168.2.51, let's see if I get any response. And you can see now that I'm getting a response nicely. So you can see that I have connectivity on my network between my Windows machine and my Mac. Yay. All right, cool. Well, what about, can I connect to my Mac from my Linux machine, which I have in my VM? So again, if I bring this up, and here's my Linux machine. I'm just going to bring this up so you can see part of it. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say ping 192.168.2.51, and do I have a response? And now you can see what a response nicely looks like, because my Windows machine blocking, but my Mac machine is not. All right? I don't have the firewall that's the same as Windows. Here's something else that I want to see also. This will continue forever. Whereas a Windows machine will stop after 4 tries by default, this will continue to try for a while. Okay, I can break out of this again by Control-C. It'll break out. You can see that the packages transmitted is 27, packages received is 27, 0% packet loss. The time, how long I did my test, for 2600 milliseconds, 26,000 milliseconds. So 26 seconds basically. And what's my average, maximum, and median kind of thing. So you can see that the minimum was 0.489 milliseconds. This is the difference between the time it took me to send the signal to my Mac and the time it responded. Okay, and then the average was 0.932, which is less than 1 millisecond access time, which is super good in my network. Okay, which is what it should be, really small. Okay, in your network. So this is good. We have connectivity between the two. This means I can probably do an SSH. Right? Now this is kind of interesting. I'm going to do a clear, and this is the thing that's in your PowerPoint. SSH, and then I'm going to do 192.168 .2.51, right? And if I do that, it's going to say the authenticity of my host, blah, 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 can't be established. Are you sure you want to continue connecting? So it's basically saying, I don't know who this Mac machine is that you're trying to connect to. Are you sure, Linux, that you want to connect to this Mac machine? And of course, I'm going to say yes, right? And then it says, what's my password? Now, guys, I know that there's no Tom account on my Mac machine. So if I put a password in and press enter, it's going to spin and it's going to say, give me that password again, because I don't know who you are. I can try it again, and it's going to basically say, third time, I can try a few times, and then it's going to just basically say, yeah, no. Tom's password. I want Tom's password. Well, Tom doesn't exist on my network, right? So if I try it a fourth time, it's going to say permission denied. I don't know what you're trying to do, Tom, but this is not, you're not going to be able to connect. Okay. So then the way to do it, just like in the PowerPoint, is say what my user ID is for the other machine. So example, my user ID might be Thomas. That's my user ID. And at that IP address, 192.168.2.51. And if I press enter, now you can see, okay, I want, oh yeah, it'd be nice if I do this. By the way, you can see that I can use my arrow keys to go to the last command. So if I go use an arrow key up, I can go to my last commands. I can go all the way up to where I want it to. So here's what I can do. And I can also just use my arrow keys to the left and inject whatever else I want. So I can say something like Thomas at, 192.168. I can do that with my arrow keys up and down. It'll remember the last commands, several commands. And if I press enter, now it'll say, okay, now what's my password? I know that Thomas is the correct user account. And now you can see that I'm logging in to another machine, another Linux machine on my system, which is my Mac. My Mac is using this Darwin version of Linux. It's a Mac OS, but I'm able to connect to my Mac right across the system. And you can see that I can do other kinds of commands, like, for example, who. Here are the the users that have logged in. You can see that my user Thomas is logged in twice, right? Actually 3 times with the console. So here is my user Thomas, and then here's another user Thomas, and you can see where they're coming from. Okay, so I want to talk about this, and then I can say, who am I, right? And if I do this, you can see, well, I'm Thomas. That's how I've logged in. I've logged in as Thomas, right? If I had other account on my Mac, then I can log in as that other person. Okay. When I want to leave the Mac, I want to log out. So let's try a couple things. Can I log out? Right? And you can see, yes, the connection is closed. And that's how back in the day it used to be. You logged into a machine through SSH or Telnet, right? And when SSH, by the way, is my preferred method of doing it, I SSH over into machine, right? And then once I SSH in, I'm actually using my other machine as the terminal. So I can do other things to my other machine, to my Mac, by basically connecting from my local machine to my Mac. And by the way, this is my underlying reasons for bridging my connection, because I knew I was going to do this. I wanted to connect to another machine and show you what it looks like when you SSH from one machine to the other. Okay? Questions around this? Everything in the settings reset. Should not reset. It should not reset. We'll talk about that later. When you reboot, you shouldn't reset. Okay, any other questions around this connectivity stuff that we're talking about? This idea of using a terminal to teleport into another machine, pretty much. I use teleport in a very loose way, right? So actually connect to another machine, log in, and I have to log in with the user account that exists in that other machine. Okay? Any questions around that? Okay, cool. So that is definitely, one way of doing it, right? I mean, I'm able to, have a local IP address that I'm using, and I'm using SSH to connect to it. Okay, thanks, Mac. I don't need you anymore, so I'm just going to leave TeamViewer because I don't need Mac that connection to be open again. TeamViewer is a little utility that I use for troubleshooting sometimes for personal use. I think it's a great little utility. I wish it was free. The other thing you can always try is Chrome, remote desktop, but I always find that this is a little flaky when I connect to my Mac. All right, so that is a couple of the commands we used. And we used SSH, that's secure shell, that's what it stands for, to connect to that other machine. And remember, we're using a shell command, right? I'm using, whenever I'm in on the on my Linux machine, I'm accessing the programs, the utilities that are on my Linux machine through a set of commands on the command line. My shell is that environment that allows me to enter commands, issue commands to the operating system. And the commands that I'm actually issuing commands to, I'm controlling the commands, they're just programs that have been written probably in C or C++ that are going to be doing something for the operating system. Okay. And it's basically showing you what a terminal window in Fedora would look like. We're just going to move on. One thing to note is that everything in Linux is case sensitive. So like it says here, John is different from John, but not so on the Windows machine, right? Windows is funny. Windows is really, really funny. The words, if I use the same directory, if I want to kind of enter a directory structure with Windows, let's suppose on Windows, here I'm going to go back to my Windows terminal, right? Here's my Windows. And if I remember that for Windows, if I want to look at my directory structure, I'm going to use the keywords dir, dir. That's the command structure for Windows. It's accessing the dir program to give me a list that's whatever files. It's going to show me a file list of everything that's in my directory. If I press enter, you get something like this, right? So if I say dir, right, and I want to look at anything that starts with D, so I want to see all things that start with D, right? In Windows, I can say dir and then D star, and that wildcard star is basically going to filter anything that's inside my folder that starts with a D. So desktop is qualified, documents. Wait a minute, .net with a lowercase d, downloads, Dropbox. All these things, but they're D's, but some of them are lowercase d, some of them belong with a dot. Like, Windows doesn't care, is the answer, right? Whereas in Linux and Mac, it absolutely cares. So I'm going to clear the screen here again with the clear command, right? Clears the terminal, right? And we're going to go in here now, and let's try and issue a similar command on the Windows side, on the Linux side. So I'm going to say the command is list. So if I press ls and press enter, you can see it gives me a list of items that are inside of my my path, and this shows me all the different folders or directories that are inside of my path. If I want to see it closer to what it looks like on the Windows side, like this in this way, let's try different ways. ls -al and press enter, and what this does, the -al, so I'm going to kind of open this up so you can see it a little bit more. ls is list, al is all, right? And what this does is it gives me a listing. We're going to cover this a little bit on Thursday more than detail. It gives me all files, including hidden files. That's what it does. So for example, notice that bash history, bash logout, bash profile, bash rc. That's a very important file. You know, and a bunch of other stuff. Anything with a dot in front of it is hidden. Even the .ssh is hidden. There's a lot of stuff in here that is hidden, right? Whereas if I just do an ls, I don't see that. I just see this. You know, I don't see the hidden files, and it's also not put in this format. There's a bunch of other things this tells me. It tells me if I have read-write access. It also tells me if it's a directory. D stands for directory when I get that, the D in here. And if it's executable. If there's anything here that's executable, you would have an E, right? Which we don't have any of these in here, right? So this is kind of, you know, kind of what a list looks like, you know. And I'm experiencing a little bit of buffering. I'm just going to pause for a second while we're doing that. Hopefully we'll be able to get back on track. How are you guys hearing me? Are we behind a little bit? Hopefully you guys are good. Now it's good again. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, I know I get a little bit of these networking streams happen, even though I've upgraded my. We lost you for a bit. Okay. Yeah, so that's how it goes. So this is how you can kind of look at your folder structure. You can see I've made I've made my terminal window much larger here, and I'm doing this because I want you to see everything. But you can see a bunch of information about this. Size of my files. You can see the owner, who's the owner, as an example, and different access, X, which is executable, as an example, right? So now if I go into that, so let's say if I want to, I'm just going to clear this, and I'm just going to do a simple ls being list, right? File list, think of it that way, right? And I'm going to look at other files in my list, as an example. Let's say, for example, I want to look at everything in my downloads. Well, I could say, I could change my directory by using cd space and the name of my directory. Now, what if I put in downloads on by the way, on a Windows machine? This would work, but if I press downloads and press enter, it's going to say, I don't know what you're talking about. There is no such thing as downloads with a lowercase d, Tom. You need to put in the right command, cd downloads with an uppercase, right? If I did that, now you can see that here's my path, Tom localhost, and I'm in the downloads directory. That's what this tells me, this little prompt, okay? So it's telling me the directory. By the way, if I ever want to know where I am, I can just go pwd. If I press pwd and press enter, it's going to show me the exact location of where I am on the command line, okay? So pwd and enter will do that for me. Okay, are you with me, everyone? I don't want to lose anybody, because this is where, I start losing people when it comes to commands. We're all good, thank you. So pwd tells me where am I from a directory perspective, right? Where am I, right? And so you see where I am. I'm in home Tom downloads. Well, what if I wanted to go to home? Well, there's a couple ways to do this. I could go cd/home and go in there, and you can see now if I did a pwd, I'm in home, right? cd means change directory, /home means go to the root and then go to home. That's what that means. Let's get back into that other one. So if I go cd tom, that's my profile. So now if I go pwd, from a pathing perspective, I'm at home Tom. That's where I'm at, right? And if I go back into downloads, cd downloads, you can see that pwd says I'm inside home Tom downloads. So I'm in the downloads subdirectory of the Tom subdirectory of the home directory. Home would be the parent of both Tom and downloads. That's the hierarchy. Because remember, in Linux and even in Windows, we're using a hierarchical file system. So files, folders. But what's inside of downloads, if I press ls and press enter, you can see I got nothing back. If I press ls -al though, you can see that I have a couple of things that come back at me. Dot and dot dot. Dot means current directory, dot dot means previous directory. And wouldn't it be nice if we could click on these and go back up if we had that kind of control? But we can't. But we could always issue, if I want to go back up one, I can just issue a cd space dot dot, and then that would just be taking me back up one level. If I went to pwd now I'm inside home Tom. So cd dot dot, that goes up one level. Cd dot doesn't go anywhere. If I go cd dot, it just keeps me where I am. Home Tom, right? By the way, if I go cd tilde, right? cd tilde, that's a special character that takes me to home Tom. cd tilde. Okay? For example, if I went to cd slash, and if I was to clear the screen for a second, clear, and if I did a pwd, you can see now I'm in this slash folder. Slash for you guys in your mind should be root. That's the root folder. Okay? If that makes any sense. Okay? So the root folder. So if I did a list now, ls, you can see that there's a lot of files in the root folder. And I want to go back to Tom home. I want to go to home Tom downloads. I can go one step at a time, right? I can go to like home tom downloads. Could do that, and then I can go pwd, and you see that's where I am. Or let's go up a level with my arrow keys. So I'm going to go up with my arrow keys. I'm just hitting the up arrow to do this, right? And if I go back to this and press enter, now I'm in the root again, right? Okay, the top level of my entire operating system, let's say, right? But what if I just want to get to home tom all at once? Then I can just go cd/home/tom/downloads. That's one way of doing it. And then if I do pwd, I'm at home tom downloads. I can put that entire path in at once. CD means change directory. All right, so or let's go back. I'm just gonna kind of go up one until I go to here. So I'm back here. Or what if I typed in cd./home/tom/downloads? Is this the same? And the answer is yes, it is, because dot means go to the same folder, look inside the home folder, look inside the tom folder, look inside the downloads folder. Okay? And the other way to do it, I'm just giving you different ways, right? Is if I said cd home tom downloads. Is this okay? And the answer is yes, it is. Why? Because home is also something that's in my folder. So Linux will accept any of these. But it makes sense. Now from just a difference between Linux and Windows, right? Let's go back to Windows here for a second. So again, I'm going to clear the screen, do a directory. You can see here's my Windows directory. And I want to go into downloads for my Windows directory. Well, let's see if I can do it just by putting anything in. I can go cd downloads. Does this work? Yeah, it does, because Windows doesn't care, my friends. It's not case sensitive like a Linux machine is. So why is this not good? And this is something that there's been people who have been fighting with Microsoft for a long time and saying, we don't like this. This should be everything should be case sensitive. But Microsoft, what they do also is they have things that are backwards compatible, and so they make it so that it is how it was before, right? Which is not case sensitive, because DOS, which is what we're looking at right here, the disk operating system, this is MS-DOS equivalent, or the command prompt. Now, this is where DOS came from, was not case sensitive, where Linux was always case sensitive. Linux and Unix in general. And case sensitivity is actually a good thing. That means I can have similar folders, but it reduces ambiguity, and it allows me to go into or access the exact file I want. And I can't make a mistake even if I wanted to. If I access a file that's not the same name, exactly the same name with the exact same spelling, then it won't work. Okay, just letting you know. Windows, of course, doesn't care. All right, so that is commands. They're case sensitive. I wanted to mention that. So it talks about the date. This is interesting. Let's talk about the date option. I want you to try this out. So again, I'm going to go to our Linux machine. Here's our Linux box. I'm going to clear the screen here. I'm going to type in date and press enter. And there, you can see the current date and time. Date minus U, right? You can see that it uses UTC time. Okay, so whereas the other one, it's using EDT, Eastern Standard Time, right? So this is our current time within our, where we are physically, right? So that kind of is our in the Eastern Hemisphere of where we are. Okay, so Eastern Standard Time, it's inside that time, that timeline as an example, right? And what we want to do is this: when we cross over from kind of one time into another time, like people who live, example, in the West, in BC and so on, every different area has a different time, and again, we use these these times, and here you can have the exact time from UTC if you want, and you can also specify other things. So that's minus U. That's the minus U option that it talks about in the PowerPoint. So it displays Greenwich Mean Time, which is kind of the standard time for the world. Okay, so that says MST. That's what it did right there, where the minus U doesn't do that. Okay. The other one you can use is you can try the cal command for the calendar. So if I ever want to go back again, I can have the cal command. And you can see it'll produce a calendar, a little quick calendar on Linux. By the way, these commands are fairly frequently used if you want to look at a calendar. And if you're a Linux user, a lot of times you don't care about user interfaces. You want to do everything through command line, and the calendar is pretty awesome. It allows you to look at the current day you're on and the date. Let's get back to this. There's also the -J option. That'll give you the Julian date. And we don't really care about that right now. We talked about the who command and who am I, right? You can add other switches. These things here are called switches. Anything that's -H after a command, they're called command switches, right? So, for example, -U is a good one. It kind of shows us the idle time for a particular user. So if I was to issue that command, so I'm going to say something like who and then -U, right? Let's see what Tom says. Tom has some idle time. It'll tell me the total idle time that I have for my particular user, right? And if I issue that command again, right, as an example, you can see that nothing much has changed because I'm not really idle, right? How about this? So it says a quick list and total of users logged in. So again, I'm going to do that up, -Q, and then do a quick list. Tom users equals number 1 equals 1, right? Okay, here's something. What if I kind of created another login? So I have, instead of one terminal window here, and I use another terminal window. Remember how we did this last time? We can go to activities, and I can control click on a PC, and I can have a second terminal window here that is up and running. So there's one terminal, here's second terminal. What if I issued that command again? So I can say 1, that's cool. If I just go who again, you can see that I've got this, and then who, I've got 1, there's just one terminal. This is, it doesn't really differentiate between one terminal and the other, me logged in. What about if I SSH? If I type the word login, right? I want to log in to my particular system. Is there a way of doing that, through through here? So did it change anything? So no, nothing happened there. What if I SSH to my IP address? Is that possible? Can I SSH to myself? Like actually connect to myself and do a ping test on my own, like basically a ping to the local machine. So what if I tried doing that? If I said SSH 192.168.2.60, because that's me. 192.168.2.60 is me, and I'm kind of SSHing to myself. Is that possible? And of course it says the connection is refused because I'm trying to connect to myself. It's not possible, right? If I have multiple users logged in, if I had another user account, like for example Mary or John, and they were logged in, I can see that both Mary and John can be logged in, right, to the account. For sure, if I go back to, actually, I don't want to go there. If I go back to my software, right, and if I go to Explore, these are all the installed programs. So contacts, here's contacts for GNOME, and so on, files, folders, all these different things. Weather, characters, these are all the different things I have kind of in here. I have a system monitor, which is kind of really cool. It talks about processes and stuff by default, and a bunch of different add-ons that I have in here, plus some support for English and so on. But if you notice, by default, right, if I scroll through here, right, and I have some characters and so on, did you notice that there's, here physically in this list, did you notice that there's not really an option for users, right? I can't go through here and actually modify users or anything like that. If I close settings, so here's settings, I want to launch settings, right? Settings actually does a bunch of other stuff for us. Remember settings, we can change the background. So if I go to background, I can modify the background image. If I don't like that image, let's say I moved to that image last time, but let's suppose I don't like it, I want this one. I can always move to this purple image. Maybe it's a little bit nicer. Don't know. Some people might like that. Applications and sounds and sharing and a bunch of other stuff. But again, notice that there isn't really any way of doing it until we get to users. So here's users, right? And it says unlock to change settings, right? So here I want to unlock, right? And it's asking me for my password to authenticate as a super user. That's me as an example. But do you see that there is a place to add user? Yes, up here on the top right, we can add a new user. Let's add the user John. And you can try this as well. It's not going to hurt you, right? So my full name should be the full name that I have. Let's call myself John Smith. And let's make my user in this case John.Smith. Is that possible? And the answer is yeah, for Linux it's totally possible. Allow the user to set a password in the login. Now let's set a password now. Let's make the user password 123456 for John, right? Okay, 123456 is a really weak password. And notice it says the password needs to be longer. Try to add more letters, numbers, and so on. 123456789, right? And it says try to avoid sequences like 1, 2, 3 or ABCD. Of course, it's going to try and not do that. It won't allow you to log in here. So let's add something else. Let's use something that's a little easier. Let's think about I don't know, the month. We'll use the month. Some people do this too. We'll say so this month. Right now it's June 1st. So we'll say June, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's pretty good. But it says hey, avoid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even if it's later on. So June 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 didn't work. Let's try June 2020, right? Hey, avoid common words. Doesn't even allow me to put passwords in. Passwords, by the way, are one of the things that that it's telling you to avoid. Even if I put in some other random characters, like a hashtag, it doesn't like June, right? Okay, let's put in Juju, right? So J-U, 2020, capital J in the first one. And it says try to avoid common words. It's still a Juju. It knows what Juju is, right? We can try other things that are random. Like for example, I don't know, B0123, as an example, and then maybe 2020, and it says avoid common words, right? But then when I add some kind of punctuation mark, let's say a hashtag, it's okay. Right, so let's try that again. So let's say if I say B, 2020, B2020, and then 1, 2, 3, and then I don't know, a hashtag at the end. Let's try that out. So capital B 2020, 1, 2, 3, and a hashtag. I'm just making this up. No, now it matches and we're good. And passwords are very important. And one thing I love about Linux is it won't allow you to make a weak password to try stuff out. Okay, so I'm going to add, and you want to notice there's two options. One is standard, and the other one is administrator. Administrator will allow me to change the system. Sometimes we want to just make a standard user, someone who's going to access the system. All right, so there we go. So standard. I'm going to click add. So here's John. And now John Smith has been added in. He's not an administrator, but he's able to access the system with this John Smith account. Okay. So if I go here, one thing you can do is you can log out, right? Or you can switch user. So what if we switched users here instead of logging out? I don't want to log out. I want to switch user to someone else. So I'm going to switch user. And again, it's John.Smith. Hopefully I can remember the password. So switch user. Takes me back to here. I can choose John Smith. And I can put B 2020 1, 2, 3 and then hashtag as my password. And it's going to allow me to come in. It's going to allow me to log into my system here for the first time. What it's going to do whenever you log into the system for the first time, it's going to run a batch script, and it's going to make it's going to do first time user login. It's going to create my home directory. Before that, John didn't have a home directory until now. As soon as I come in, as an example, then I'd be able to now notice like John somehow wasn't allowed in. Can anyone tell me why you think John wasn't allowed in? Right? So I did the proper thing, but hey, I put B, 2020, 123, hashtag, and then I press enter. But John was not allowed in for this for the first time. Right? First, he's creating stuff. It tells me my welcome message. I can go next. It tells me my English. I can click next. All the same kind of stuff: privacy, automatic problem reporting. Next, and I don't want to connect anything online. I can skip just like normal. I'm making a brand new user, and his name is John. All right, by chance, and a little bit of starting videos, which I highly recommend you take a look at when you have a chance. Great. John has been logged in. Now let's issue that other command that we did before. And again, notice that it's not here by default. I have to go here again, just like we did last time. And what I want to do is I want to pull in the command for my command line. It's a terminal command, right, that I want to use. One thing I can do is just type in terminal, right, here, and if I don't know the command, and I can just launch the terminal window. And when I do that, the terminal's running. Bring it over here, you can see that the terminal is now live. I can right click on here and I can add to favorites. So now I'm always going to have the terminal here, and I can drag this terminal up just like I did last time with my thing, but it's like we're starting from scratch again, right? So notice you can see a couple things. John.Smith at localhost is the person that's logged in, not Tom anymore that I'm looking at. And if I did again a who and press enter, you can see now I have both users logged in. I have Tom and I have John Smith. Okay. So a couple things that that you guys can do here. So you can have multiple users logged into the system. Okay. So if I wanted to see, who am I, or just who and minus Q, let's try that out. So if I say who and minus Q, you can see now that I have two users, Tom and John. Total number of users logged in the system is 2. Here's something. Can I log out from the system? Well, not really. I can exit the shell. That is something I can do. Oh, there's some software available. Not now. But I'd have to log off here, right? Doesn't allow you to. So I can log out John Smith. I'm logging him off. There we go. And now that I've logged off, it's going to take me back to the login screen that allows me to log in as Tom, because Tom or John is here, right? So Tom, I can go in there and I can log in with my user account like normal. There we go. I created John. Here's something. Can I delete John? Right now that I've created John, what if I don't want John in here anymore? What can I do? I can unlock. So there we go. And you can see that I can remove the user on the bottom. So user support, it's pretty simple. I can just click here and delete the user. It's going to say, do you want to keep John Smith's files? If I do, it keeps the home directory, but it doesn't give him access anymore. And sometimes this is good. For example, if you have a user that's temporary on your system, and you want to remove access because they're not working for you anymore, but maybe when they come working for you again, you want to kind of enable them again. You don't want them to delete the files because that would be really bad. And a lot of times what you can also do is you can disable the account, right? So, and by the way, you can look at account activity. So here's the session start and end. I can monitor people if I really want to, who went into my system. And we'll talk about security and all that stuff later. But let's just remove John for now because I don't want him to be on my system. I want to delete all his files. And now, in a few minutes, even if we come back in a few seconds, we're going to come back in and there is no John anymore. John, he doesn't exist anymore in my system. He's gone. I noticed when I come back in, my terminals are all kind of up the same way they were before. We're almost done. So I did the who command. That's the one command we did. And the clear command we've talked about at length. Command line history views with our up and down arrows. Logging out, we can use Control D for it on the command line, but a lot of times we're using a UI. So in our case, that won't matter for logging out physically. Sometimes what we want to do is we want to use super user commands, which we're going to get into. You can use su, so that's su, or sudo, super user do. We're going to get to that in a second, all right? Terminal, by the way, TTY is terminal. And that's how we do it. So it says here's a default setting. My host name with the computer administrator, I'm the system administrator that's logged in, but it's because, you'll see if it wasn't, if just a regular user, you'll see different things. Okay, so that's what the rest of this works is. If I want to change my password, I definitely can do that with the passwd command. Okay, so password command. And so I can change my password. One thing to note is if you wanted to change your password, you'd have to know your current password in order for you to change to something else. Okay, so I just wanted to let you know that. A lot of times what I recommend, if you're changing passwords, do it through the user interface if you're afraid. One thing to note is if you forget your password, nothing can help you get back in. It's not like you can break into Linux, and it's a pretty secure system. So if you forgot your password, you're done, right? So here's a bit of best practices for you while we're finished this PowerPoint. If you want to make sure that you always are having a way in, create a super user account. For example, my super user account is Tom, right? And make a secondary account, right, that you can access. Make a secondary account that you can access that you can mess up, okay? If you don't care about this other account, you can make it so that it's a account that is secure. Wow, this is a pretty bleak picture. I'd rather have a nicer picture. Sorry, let's get back to that. I don't like that picture, right? I like a nicer picture than this. I mean, the colors are nice, but I think I want to make the background a little bit, nicer, right? Which is maybe something that looks like this. My problem with all these backgrounds, by the way, and I'm going to talk about how to remove backgrounds. One thing that we used to have on previous versions of Fedora Linux was the ability just to go with a flat color, and by default they've removed that. So I'm going to go back to this as an option. Right, I don't want to, and you can see oh yeah, I love it when this happens. So this is something that happens sometimes. You might get a bit of a freeze happening. Don't despair. Remember that you're running a VM, and sometimes your system has got its process manager that's running in the background. That's basically allocating the amount of the order of what all the processes are going to run in. So don't despair so much. Give your VM a chance. All right, so. Again, I've changed my picture back to this, and we're back to normal again. So, review, question for you guys. We just covered a little bit of networking, very, very high level. How to ping, we should know how to ping. Pinging allows us to kind of check the connectivity between our two devices on the network, and we did that with my device here, which is my virtual device, my Linux box, as well as my host device, which denied all connections, and my Mac on the system, which accepted the connections. We created a user, and we did some really basic commands, and some of the commands we did were very common. ls for list, cd for change directory. Next day, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing copy and create directory, make directory, all those kind of things you should know how to do, and that by chance is part of what you're going to be doing on your assignment number 1. Is creating some directories, checking stuff out, making some changes on your system. All those kind of things are things that I'm going to ask you to do. So now that we're done this part, I'm going to stop recording. But remember, just a reminder, there's 2 things that are due. One is your quiz that's due by Friday. So please get your quiz done sometime between now and Friday at midnight, as well as your demo video. If you're one of that 5%, if you're after that 5%, it's due tomorrow night at midnight. So make sure you get that done. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording now, and I'll take some questions for the remainder of the time, which is 0 time. All right.